The rifle range fell silent at 600 hours, the kind of silence that carries weight in the Marine Corps. 23 recruits stood at attention while gunnery Sergeant Kovacs paced behind them, his boots grinding sand into concrete. The morning fog hadn't lifted from Camp Pendleton, and visibility sat at maybe 200 meters, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the woman standing at the 200-yard line, holding a borrowed M40A6 like she'd been born with it. Nobody knew her name yet. She'd walked onto the range 15 minutes earlier, watched 4 qualified scout snipers miss consecutive shots at a standard torso target, and asked the question that would become legend. Her voice was steady, almost bored. "Mind if I borrow that rifle?" The snipers had laughed. Of course they'd laughed. She wore no rank insignia, no unit patch, just plain olive-drab utilities that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back tight enough to hurt, sun-weathered skin suggesting years somewhere hot and unforgiving, but her eyes carried something else. Something the snipers missed while exchanging grins. Kovacs didn't laugh. He'd been a Marine for 22 years, and he'd learned to recognize the particular stillness that comes from genuine competence. The woman's posture was wrong for a civilian, but right for someone who'd spent time behind a scope. Her trigger finger rested along the receiver in textbook form, and when she glanced at the wind flags downrange, her eyes tracked with methodical precision. "Range is cold," Kovacs announced, voice cutting through the snickering. "Weapons clear." The 4 snipers secured their rifles, still grinning. One of them, Corporal Hastings, muttered something about stolen valor that earned him a sharp look from Kovacs. The woman walked to the firing line and accepted the rifle from Staff Sergeant Reyes, who handed it over with theatrical courtesy, like presenting a sword to a child. She checked the chamber, examined the scope's zero, and settled into prone position with movements so fluid they seemed rehearsed. The fog was lifting now, revealing the full range. 200 yards, then 300, then 500 stretching into the California hills. Standard man-sized targets at each distance, steel plates that rang when struck. 47 Marines had qualified on this range in the past month. All of them had needed multiple attempts. The woman adjusted the scope elevation, chambered around, and acquired her first target. Her breathing slowed until it became nearly invisible, her body sinking into the earth like roots finding purchase. The rifle looked natural against her shoulder, an extension of intent rather than a tool. Kovacs raised his binoculars. Something about this felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. The woman's finger moved to the trigger, taking up slack with the kind of patience that can't be taught, only earned through repetition measured in years rather than months. The first shot cracked across the range at 6:14 hours, the sound sharp and clean in the morning air. Through his binoculars, Kovacs watched the 200-yard target shudder as the round punched through center mass, maybe an inch left of true center. The woman cycled the bolt without lifting her head from the scope, brass ejecting in a golden arc that caught the early light. Her breathing never changed. Second shot, 2 seconds later. Dead center. The murmuring behind Kovacs stopped. The rifle's report echoed off the hills, returning to them like a question nobody wanted to answer. Third shot. Center mass again, this time maybe half an inch right. She was walking the rounds in a pattern so tight it looked like a malfunction in the targeting software they used for training. But there was no software here, just Kentucky windage and the kind of muscle memory that made experts nervous. "Who the hell is she?" Reyes whispered, but Kovacs didn't answer. He was counting shots now, watching the woman work through the magazine with mechanical precision. Fourth shot. Fifth. Sixth. Each one struck within a 3-inch circle at 200 yards, which was respectable for a trained sniper and absolutely unnerving for someone who'd walked onto the range without credentials. The snipers weren't laughing anymore. Hastings had his own binoculars up now, watching the target through optics that confirmed what his eyes didn't want to believe. The woman emptied the first magazine in 40 seconds flat, 5 rounds finding home with consistency that suggested she could do this in her sleep. She cleared the rifle, accepted another magazine from Reyes without a word, and shifted her point of aim to the 300-yard line. Still prone, still breathing in that slow rhythm that suggested meditation more than marksmanship. Kovacs checked his watch. Time wasn't the issue here, but he logged it anyway, habit from 2 decades of evaluating Marines. The second magazine lasted 38 seconds. 5 rounds, 5 hits, all within a 4-inch spread at 300 yards. The wind had picked up slightly, maybe 3 knots from the west, and the woman adjusted for it without using the spotting scope. She was reading the wind by watching the grass between her position and the target, a skill that took most snipers months to develop. She made it look instinctive. "Sir," Hastings said quietly, "that's not normal." Kovacs didn't respond. Normal had left the building the moment this woman asked her question. He was starting to piece together possibilities now, running through mental files of every female Marine sniper he'd heard about. The Corps had only graduated a handful, and fewer still had achieved anything approaching this level of proficiency. The woman cleared the rifle again, accepted a third magazine, and settled back into position. This time she aimed at the 500-yard target, where wind and elevation made shooting less about mechanics and more about reading conditions that changed second by second. The fog had burned off completely now, replaced by that crystalline California morning light that made distances deceptive. The target looked closer than it was, but the woman wasn't fooled. She took an extra 10 seconds, reading the mirage that rose from the range floor before firing. The sound reached them first, then the distant ring of steel being struck. Through the binoculars, Kovacs saw the hit marker 2 inches high, 1 inch right of center. Compensation shot followed 3 seconds later, adjusting for what the first round had taught her. This one struck dead center, and the 4 that followed matched it so precisely they could have been fired by a machine rest. The rifle went quiet at 6:22 hours, and the woman stood with the same fluid motion she'd used to go prone. She cleared the weapon completely, locked the bolt to the rear, and handed it back to Reyes with a nod that might have been thanks or might have been dismissal. The staff sergeant took it like he was accepting a holy relic, his hand slightly unsteady. Nobody spoke. The woman brushed sand from her utilities and started walking toward the range exit, her gait unhurried, like she'd just finished a routine task of no particular importance. "Wait," Kovacs called out, his voice carrying the authority of rank and something else, something closer to genuine curiosity. The woman stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her expression was carefully neutral, the face of someone who'd learned to present nothing at all to the world. Up close, Kovacs revised his earlier estimate. She wasn't in her 20s like he'd assumed. Crow's feet framed her eyes, and her hands showed the kind of scarring that came from hard work in harder places. 30s, maybe late 30s, with the weathered quality of someone who'd spent years under a sun that didn't forgive. "You got a name?" Kovacs asked. "Most people do," she replied, and there was a trace of accent there, something southwestern but buried under years of military diction. "I'm asking for yours specifically." She studied him for a moment, and Kovacs got the impression he was being evaluated with the same precision she'd applied to those targets. Whatever criteria she was using, he apparently passed, because her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, and her expression softened from neutral to something approaching human. "Marlowe," she said. "Captain Marlowe." The rank hit the assembled Marines like a physical force. Officers didn't just wander onto enlisted ranges, and captains definitely didn't show up in plain utilities without warning. Kovacs felt the pieces starting to assemble, but the picture they were forming didn't make sense yet. "Captain," he said carefully, "mind if I ask what brings you to my range?" Marlowe's eyes tracked past him to where the 4 scout snipers stood frozen in various states of disbelief. "Heard you had a problem," she said. "Qualified shooters missing standard targets. Thought I'd see it for myself." Hastings found his voice first, which was unfortunate because Hastings rarely thought before speaking. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but we were just having an off morning. Those targets are properly zeroed. You jerked the trigger on your first shot," Marlowe interrupted, her tone conversational. "Anticipated the recoil on your second. Third shot was actually decent, but you didn't adjust for the wind shift at 230 seconds into your string. Fourth shot you rushed because you were embarrassed about missing the first 3. The silence that followed was the kind that made oxygen feel expensive. Hastings opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again without producing sound. Marlowe's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she'd made this speech before, probably more times than she cared to remember. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," she continued, addressing all four snipers now. "I'm here because Gunnery Sergeant Kovacs requested an evaluation of his Scout Sniper program, and my assessment is that your fundamentals are solid but your stress inoculation needs work." She pulled a small notepad from her cargo pocket, flipped it open to a page covered in precise handwriting. The notepad looked like it had survived a war, its edges frayed and pages water-stained in patterns that suggested multiple deployments to places where waterproof gear was more suggestion than reality. Marlowe consulted it briefly, though Kovacs suspected she didn't actually need to. The gesture seemed more about giving the snipers a moment to process than about refreshing her memory. "Corporal Hastings," she said, still reading, "graduated top of your Scout Sniper class at Quantico, February 2023. Designated marksman before that, 317 confirmed hits on deployment to Syria. You're technically proficient, but you've developed a flinch that manifests under observation. You shoot better when nobody's watching." Hastings looked like he'd been shot himself. Marlowe moved on without waiting for confirmation. "Staff Sergeant Reyes, second-generation Marine, sniper qualified since 2021. You're solid under pressure, but you've been training these Marines to shoot the way you shoot, which works for your body type but not for theirs. Corporal Hastings is 6 inches shorter than you. His natural point of aim is different." Reyes nodded slowly, processing. Kovacs was starting to understand why his request for an evaluation had been answered by someone wearing captain's bars. This wasn't a random inspection. This was surgical. "Lance Corporal Vickers," Marlowe continued, focusing on the youngest of the four snipers, barely 22 and still carrying the eager expression of someone who believed competence would be enough. "You're rushing your breathing cycle. You learned to shoot in basic, passed every qualification, but nobody ever taught you that the exhale isn't the finish line, it's the beginning. You're taking the shot at the bottom of your breath when you should be taking it in the pause that follows." Vickers swallowed hard, nodded. The fourth sniper, Sergeant Chen, didn't wait for his turn. "What about me, ma'am?" Marlowe looked at him with something that might have been approval. "You don't have a fundamental problem, Sergeant Chen. You have a confidence problem. You second-guess yourself after the first shot, and that hesitation cascades through the rest of your string. You shot expert on every range qualification since 2020, but you've convinced yourself you got lucky." Chen's jaw worked, but he didn't argue. Kovacs watched this small woman dismantle four trained snipers with nothing but observation and honesty, and he felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He'd requested this evaluation 3 months ago, frustrated by a platoon of technically qualified snipers who couldn't perform under pressure. Division had promised to send someone, but the request had disappeared into the administrative void where most paperwork went to die. Apparently it hadn't died. It had just taken time to root through whatever channels produced Captain Marlowe. "You qualified all 4 of them," Marlowe said, turning to Kovacs now. "That tells me they can shoot. But qualification and application are different animals, and somewhere between the range and the field, these Marines are losing their edge." She closed the notepad, tucked it back into her cargo pocket. "With your permission, Gunny, I'd like to spend the next week working with your Scout snipers, not to replace your training, but to supplement it. Specifically stress inoculation and performance under observation." Kovacs glanced at the 4 snipers, saw them watching Marlowe with expressions that ranged from cautious hope to outright intimidation. This was unusual, having an officer work directly with enlisted Marines on a skill-specific task. But unusual didn't mean wrong, and Kovacs hadn't survived 22 years in the Corps by letting protocol override common sense. The decision took Kovacs approximately 3 seconds, which was longer than necessary but short enough to suggest confidence. "Permission granted, ma'am," he said, and felt the dynamic on the range shift immediately. The 4 snipers straightened unconsciously, responding to the change in command structure with the instinctive adjustment that made the Marine Corps functional. Marlowe nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and finality. "Good," We'll start tomorrow, 5:30 hours. Today these Marines get to go home and think about what they saw. She turned to leave again, made it 3 steps before Hastings found whatever passed for courage in his particular brand of confusion. "Ma'am, can I ask where you qualified?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Kovacs saw Marlowe's shoulders tense fractionally, saw the micro-expression that crossed her face before discipline smoothed it away. This was dangerous territory, the kind of question that seemed innocent but carried implications about legitimacy and respect. In a corps that had only recently fully integrated women into combat roles, questions about qualifications were never quite as simple as they sounded. "You can ask," Marlowe said without turning around, "but you're asking the wrong question. Ma'am, you want to know if I'm legitimate, if those shots were luck or skill, if I have the credibility to train you." Now she turned, and Kovacs saw something harder in her expression, something that had been hidden under the professional courtesy. "The answer is that I've been shooting since before you knew which end of the rifle made noise, Corporal. I qualified at Quantico in 2015, back when the instructors made it very clear that women snipers were a political statement rather than a tactical asset. I deployed to Helmand Province in 2016, Mosul in 2017, and spent 18 months in Syria doing work that doesn't appear in any official record, because officially I was never there." The range felt smaller suddenly, the morning light sharper. Hastings had gone pale, and the other snipers wore expressions suggesting they wished they could disappear into the sand beneath their boots. "I've taken shots that mattered," Marlowe continued, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. "Shots where missing meant friendly casualties. Shots where the target was moving, where the wind was gusting, where I was operating on 3 hours of sleep in 4 days, and the rifle I was using had been zeroed for someone else. I've made shots at distances that would make your qualification ranges look like a carnival game, and I've missed shots that cost me nights of sleep I'll never get back." She paused, and Kovacs realized he was holding his breath. "So when I tell you that your fundamentals need work, Corporal Hastings, I'm not guessing. I'm not theorizing. I'm giving you the benefit of experience purchased at a price you haven't paid yet and hopefully never will. Am I legitimate? I'm the only female Marine sniper to receive a Silver Star for actions in combat. I've trained counter-sniper teams in 3 countries whose names I can't mention. And before I took a desk job that's slowly killing me from boredom, I was the go-to instructor for high-value target interdiction, because I could put rounds through windows at distances that made the men in my unit uncomfortable." The silence was absolute. Even the wind had stopped, or maybe Kovacs had just stopped noticing it. Marlowe's expression softened again. The anger or frustration or whatever had driven that speech fatting back into professional courtesy. "But none of that matters tomorrow at 5:30 hours, she said. "What matters is whether you 4 are willing to learn from someone who doesn't look like what you expected. If you are, I'll teach you things that will keep you alive and make you better at your job. If you're not, then we're all wasting our time, and I'll file my report with division and catch the next flight back to Quantico." Nobody spoke for approximately 5 seconds, which in military time felt like an eternity. Then Sergeant Chen stepped forward, came to attention with the kind of precision that made drill instructors weep with joy, and said, "Ma'am, thank you for your service and for taking the time to work with us. We'll be here at 5:30. The other 3 snipers followed his lead, forming a rank that would have made their boot camp instructors proud. Marlowe studied them for a moment, and Kovacs saw her expression shift again, the hardness dissolving into something that might have been satisfaction or might have been relief. "Outstanding," she said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be educational." She left without further ceremony, walking across the range toward the distant parking lot with that same unhurried gait. Kovacs watched her go, then turned to his snipers. They were still at attention, still processing what had just happened. "At ease," he said, and they relaxed fractionally. "Gunny," Reyes said quietly, "what just happened?" Kovacs considered the question. What had happened was that 4 competent Marines had just met someone operating on a level they hadn't known existed. What had happened was that the core experiment with integrating women into combat specialties had produced someone who exceeded the standards most men struggled to meet. What had happened was that Kovacs's faith in requesting help had been validated in a way that made him grateful and slightly terrified. "You just met the standard you're trying to achieve," Kovacs said finally, "and you discovered that the standard doesn't care about your expectations." He dismissed them, watched them gather their gear with the subdued movements of people whose worldview had been violently recalibrated. Hastings lingered, looking like he wanted to ask something but couldn't find the words. "Spit it out, Corporal," Kovacs said. "Gunny, did you know? About Captain Marlowe, I mean. Did you know who they were sending?" Kovacs shook his head. "I requested an evaluation. Division sent who they sent. I'm not complaining about the results." Hastings nodded, started to leave, then stopped. "She said Silver Star for combat. I didn't know any female Marines had received one for direct combat action." "Neither did I," Kovacs admitted. "But I'm not surprised. Excellence doesn't ask permission, Corporal. It just shows up and performs." That night, Kovacs pulled Captain Marlowe's service record, using the kind of administrative privileges that technically weren't meant for casual research, but that senior NCOs learned to access anyway. What he found made the morning's demonstration make considerably more sense. Marlowe, first name Cattery, born in Flagstaff, Arizona. Enlisted at 18, made corporal in record time, picked up sergeant before her first combat deployment. Officer candidate school at 24, commissioned second lieutenant despite recommendations from 3 senior officers who suggested she was better suited to remain enlisted. Scout sniper qualified on her second attempt, the first having been denied not for performance but for program capacity limitations that everyone knew meant gender. Deployed 6 times in 8 years, 3 of those deployments listed simply as advisory capacity with locations redacted. Silver Star awarded 2018, citation classified. Bronze Star with Valor Device 2017. Purple Heart 2016. Transferred to Training Command 2022, current assignment, curriculum development for advanced marksmanship programs. Kovacs closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling of his office. The Marine Corps had sent him a weapon-grade instructor with a resume that read like propaganda, except it was all verified and documented and real. Tomorrow morning at 5:30 hours, 4 scout snipers were going to get an education that might save their lives, and Kovacs was going to watch it happen, which in its own way felt like a privilege. The morning of November 3rd arrived with the kind of cold that made breath visible and motivation scarce. Kovacs reached the range at 5:20 hours, expecting to be first, and found Captain Marlowe already there. She transformed the standard range setup into something resembling a tactical obstacle course. Barricades at irregular intervals, uneven shooting platforms, and what looked like speakers positioned at various points down the range. "Gunny," she greeted him, not looking up from the tablet she was operating. "Hope you don't mind that I requisitioned some equipment. It'll all go back to supply by Friday." Kovacs surveyed the additions. "What's the plan, ma'am?" "Stress inoculation," Marlowe said, finally looking up. She traded yesterday's plain utilities for proper camouflage, and Kovacs noticed the captain's bars on her collar were slightly tarnished, the way insignia got when it had been deployed multiple times. "These Marines can shoot. They can't shoot when it matters. That's a training deficit, not a talent deficit." The 4 snipers arrived at 5:28 hours, 2 minutes early, which suggested they'd been anxious about today. They looked rested but wary, the expression of people approaching a test they couldn't adequately prepare for. Marlowe checked her watch, nodded approval at their timing, and gestured toward the modified range. "Here's how this week works," she said without preamble. "Each of you will shoot every day under progressively degraded conditions. Today we start simple, shoot while being watched. Tomorrow we add time pressure. Wednesday we add physical exhaustion. Thursday we add auditory stress. Friday we combine everything and see what sticks." She pulled out 4 sets of electronic hearing protection, newer models than the standard issue gear. "These are active noise systems. They'll protect your hearing but allow normal conversation. More importantly, they'll allow me to talk to you while you're shooting, which most of you will find incredibly distracting. That's the point. Vickers raised his hand, remembered he wasn't in a classroom, lowered it. Ma'am, is this based on actual combat conditions? Marlowe smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. No, Lance Corporal. Combat is exponentially worse than anything I can legally create on a training range. This is based on the minimum stress level you'll need to perform under if you want to stay alive and keep your team alive. Think of this as the shallow end of the pool. Combat is the ocean during a hurricane. She distributed the hearing protection, waited while they fitted the devices properly, then had them test the communication system. Kovacs heard her voice coming through clearly, conversational, but with that thread of command that made ignoring her impossible. Corporal Hastings, you're up first. Standard prone position, 200-yard target, 5 rounds. But I'm going to stand behind you and critique every aspect of your technique while you shoot. Begin. Hastings moved to the firing line, settled into prone with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. His breathing steadied, his position looked textbook perfect, and his finger moved to the trigger with appropriate care. Then Marlowe started talking. Your left elbow is 4 inches too far forward. That's creating tension in your shoulder that'll affect your natural point of aim. Your breathing is good, but you're holding too long at the bottom of the exhale. Your trigger finger position looks correct, but I can see micro-adjustments that suggest you're anticipating recoil. The wind just shifted, did you notice? No, you didn't, because you're focused on me instead of your target. That's going to be a problem. Hastings took the shot. Through his binoculars, Kovacs saw the impact 6 inches left of center, a miss that would have been embarrassing for a boot private. Marlowe's voice continued, relentless and conversational. That was exactly what I expected. You heard my voice, processed my criticism, and jerked the trigger because you were thinking instead of executing. Let's try again, but this time I want you to treat my voice like wind noise. It exists, you acknowledge it exists, but it doesn't change your fundamentals. Hastings cycled the bolt, acquired the target again, and Kovacs watched his body language shift slightly. Less tension in the shoulders, more fluidity in the follow-through. The second shot struck 4 inches right of center, closer but still outside acceptable parameters. Better, Marlowe said. You're learning. Third shot, and this time I'm going to tell you a story while you shoot. In 2017, I was outside Mosul, overwatch position on a 3-story building that was mostly rubble. My spotter was a gunnery sergeant named Macready who had 18 years in the Corps and a habit of talking constantly. He talked about his kids, his wife's cooking, the Red Sox, anything that came into his head. Drove me absolutely insane. Hastings took his third shot. Center mass, clean hit. Marlowe continued without acknowledging the improvement. Macready talked because he knew silence was dangerous. Silence let you think too much, let your brain convince you that the next shot was the one that would expose your position or miss the target or end someone's life. He kept me in the present tense by making it impossible to catastrophize the future. Took me 2 months to understand what he was doing. Took me another month to appreciate it. The fourth shot matched the third. Hastings was finding rhythm now, his breathing synchronized with Marlowe's narrative in a way that suggested he'd stopped fighting the distraction and started incorporating it. Macready died in 2019, Marlowe said, her tone unchanged from the conversational cadence she'd maintained throughout. Training accident at 29 Palms, nothing heroic or meaningful, just wrong place, wrong time, and suddenly gone. I think about him every time I teach because he taught me that the voice in your head is more dangerous than any external noise. Fifth shot, Corporal. Hastings took it. Dead center, the sound of steel ringing clear across the range. Marlowe nodded, made a note on her tablet. Outstanding. You just learned something important. The distraction isn't the enemy. Your reaction to distraction is the enemy. Staff Sergeant Reyes, you're up. The pattern repeated with variations. Reyes shot while Marlowe questioned his training methodology, asked him to explain his technique between shots, challenged his assumptions about how bodies interact with rifles. Reyes struggled initially, grew frustrated, then found the same rhythm Hastings had discovered. By his fifth shot, he was talking back to Marlowe, answering her questions while simultaneously executing perfect trigger control. Vickers came next, and Marlowe changed tactics. She went silent, letting him settle into position, letting him find his breathing cycle and natural point of aim. Then just as he was about to take his first shot, she clapped her hands once sharply, directly behind his head. Vickers flinched, jerked the trigger, missed by a foot. "Again," Marlowe said. Same setup, same silence, same clap at the critical moment. Vickers flinched less, missed by 8 inches. Again. Third time, Vickers anticipated the clap, tensed before it came, still missed. Fourth time, something clicked. He took the shot in the half-second before the clap, ignoring Marlowe's presence entirely, and the round struck home. "Good," Marlowe said. "You just learned that anticipation is another form of distraction. You can't prevent the stimulus, but you can choose when to execute despite it." Fifth shot. Vickers made it clean. Sergeant Chen approached the line with visible trepidation, and Kovacs didn't blame him. Marlowe had demonstrated 3 different stress techniques, and Chen had no way of knowing which she'd employ. She let him wonder for approximately 15 seconds before speaking. "Sergeant Chen, I'm going to shoot next to you. Same target, same time, 5 rounds, we'll see who's more accurate." She picked up a second rifle, settled into prone position beside him, mirrored his setup. Chen looked at her, looked at Kovacs, found no help in either direction. "Ma'am, is this regulation?" "No," Marlowe said cheerfully. "It's also not dangerous, assuming we both follow proper firearm safety, and I've already cleared it with the gunny. Whenever you're ready, Sergeant." Chen took approximately 10 seconds to process this development, then settled into his shooting position with the resignation of someone who'd accepted that normalcy had left the building. He acquired the target, began his breathing cycle, and Kovacs saw the exact moment when he decided to stop thinking and start executing. Both rifles fired within a half-second of each other, the reports blending into a single sharp crack. Kovacs watched 2 impacts on the target, both center mass, separated by maybe an inch. Chen cycled his bolt, adjusted something in his position, and fired again. Marlowe matched him, her bolt worked smooth and unhurried. 2 more hits, same tight grouping. They continued through the 5-round string, and by the end Chen was smiling, the tension that had characterized his earlier shooting completely absent. He'd stopped competing and started performing, which Kovacs suspected was exactly the lesson Marlowe had intended. "How'd I do, ma'am?" Chen asked as they cleared their weapons. Marlowe consulted her tablet, brought up whatever spotting system she'd integrated with the range cameras. "You shot a 4-inch group at 200 yards while shooting simultaneously with another person. You maintained consistent form, didn't rush your shots, and improved with each round." "I shot a 3.2-inch group, but I've had more practice." She stood, brushed sand from her utilities. "The point isn't that I'm better, Sergeant. The point is that you performed better under artificial competition than you did during qualification when the only pressure was passing the test. Your confidence problem isn't about ability. It's about context. You shoot better when you're not thinking about whether you can shoot." Chen nodded slowly, processing. Kovacs saw understanding dawn in his expression, that particular light that came when a Marine suddenly grasped something that had been invisible before. "Ma'am, could we do that again tomorrow?" "No," Marlowe said. "Tomorrow you'll shoot exhausted, but we'll revisit this on Friday." She dismissed them for a 30-minute break, during which the 4 snipers clustered together in intense conversation. Kovacs approached Marlowe, who was reviewing footage on her tablet, making notes that seemed more clinical than critical. "That was impressive, ma'am," he said. Marlowe shrugged. "It's not impressive. It's systematic. Every failure in shooting performance traces back to either physical fundamentals or psychological interference. These Marines have good fundamentals, which means the problem is psychological. Stress inoculation addresses that by making the abnormal normal, by teaching the brain that distractions are just environmental factors rather than threats." She pulled up a comparison chart showing all 4 snipers' performance. "By Friday, they'll shoot under combined stress conditions better than they shot during qualification under ideal conditions. Not because they'll have become better shots, but because they'll have become better at managing their internal state. That's the difference between a qualified sniper and an effective one." Kovacs studied the data, seeing patterns he hadn't noticed during the live shooting. How'd you develop this training program? Marlowe's expression shifted, something guarded entering her eyes. Trial and error, she said. Mostly error. I spent 3 years as a sniper instructor after my combat deployments, and I noticed that we were teaching technique but not application. We were producing Marines who could shoot perfectly on ranges and adequately in combat. I wanted to close that gap. The week progressed with the methodical intensity that characterized military training at its best. Tuesday brought time pressure, with Marlowe using a shot timer that beeped at irregular intervals. The snipers had to engage targets within compressed windows while maintaining accuracy, learning to balance speed with precision in a way that went against every instinct scout sniper training had instilled. Hastings struggled most with this evolution, his careful nature rebelling against the imposed urgency, but by the end of the day he'd learned to trust his fundamentals enough to let them execute without conscious oversight. Wednesday was physical exhaustion. Marlowe had them run 2 miles in full gear, then immediately transition to shooting positions. Heart rates elevated, breathing ragged, hands trembling from exertion, and yet they shot. The first rounds were predictably terrible, impacts scattered across the target in patterns that would have earned failing grades on any standard qualification. But Marlowe didn't care about the first rounds. She cared about the adaptation, the way their bodies learned to shoot through exhaustion rather than after recovering from it. By the 30th repetition, even Vickers was maintaining acceptable groupings while his heart rate sat above 140. Thursday introduced auditory stress, and Kovacs understood why Marlowe had requisitioned those speakers. She played recordings through them, radio chatter, gunfire, explosions, the chaotic symphony of combat compressed into audio form. The snipers shot through it, learning to partition their attention, to process critical information while filtering non-critical stimulus. Reyes adapted fastest to this evolution, his combat experience in Syria providing context that helped him categorize the sounds. But even Chen, who'd never deployed to an active combat zone, showed marked improvement by day's end. Friday morning arrived with weather that matched the week's intensity, overcast, cold, wind gusting to 15 knots. Marlowe stood at the range entrance, wearing full combat gear that made Kovacs revise his estimate of her size. She looked smaller under all that equipment, but her posture suggested the weight was familiar rather than burdensome. Final evolution, she announced as the 4 snipers assembled. They looked different than they had Monday morning, Kovacs noted. More confident maybe, or perhaps just more aware of their own capabilities. You'll shoot 200 yards, then 300, then 500. Between each distance, you'll complete a physical task I'll assign. I'll be talking in your ear, the audio stress system will be active, and you'll be timed. Make all 15 shots on target, any hits acceptable, and you've successfully completed the training. Questions? Hastings raised his hand. Ma'am, what if we fail? Then you've learned something valuable about your current limitations, Marlowe said. But you won't fail. You've spent 4 days learning these skills. Today you demonstrate them. Sergeant Chen, you're first. Chen approached the line, and Kovacs saw the subtle shift in his demeanor that suggested he'd internalized Marlowe's lessons about confidence. He settled into position, acquired the 200-yard target, and Kovacs heard Marlowe's voice over the communication system. What's your daughter's name, Sergeant? Chen's shot sequence didn't falter. Emma, ma'am. How old? 7. He took his first shot, clean hit. What's her favorite color? Purple. Second shot, another hit. The audio stress system activated, playing the sounds of a firefight at volume that made Kovacs wince. Chen continued shooting, answering Marlowe's questions about his daughter's school, her interests, her dreams. 5 shots, 5 hits, conversation maintained throughout. He finished, cleared his weapon, and Marlowe directed him to the physical evolution. 50 push-ups, done immediately. Chen dropped and performed them without complaint, his breathing controlled despite the exertion. At 48 push-ups, the audio system cut out. At 50, he stood, returned to the line, acquired the 300-yard target. The second string went similarly, though Marlowe's questions got more personal, probing into Chen's decisions to join the Corps, his fears about deployment, his hopes for his family. Chen answered while shooting, his hits consistent despite the psychological pressure. The audio system played sounds of wounded Marines calling for corpsmen, and Kovacs saw Chen's jaw tighten but his trigger control remained steady. 5 more hits. Physical evolution 2. Sprint 200 yards, then low crawl 50 yards. Chen executed it, returned to the line breathing hard, face flushed with exertion. The 500-yard target represented the culmination of everything the week had taught. Wind was variable now, gusting from multiple directions, and the audio system layered in sounds of chaos. Marlowe's voice came through, quieter now but somehow more insistent. "This is where it matters, Sergeant. Heart rate elevated, breathing compromised, attention divided. But your fundamentals remain constant. Trust them." Chen took his first shot at 500 yards. The round struck low and left, catching the edge of the target. He adjusted without visible frustration, took his second shot. Center mass. The remaining 3 shots grouped within 6 inches of each other, a performance that under these conditions represented excellence. "Outstanding," Marlowe said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice now. "You just shot better under maximum stress than you did during your last qualification under ideal conditions. That's the standard. Hold on to it." The other 3 snipers followed similar patterns, each facing slightly different psychological pressure points that Marlowe had apparently identified during the week. Hastings got questions about his career aspirations, forcing him to articulate ambitions while executing under pressure. Vickers faced mathematical problems between shots, engaging his analytical brain while his body maintained muscle memory. Reyes shot while Marlowe described combat scenarios, forcing him to process tactical information while executing fundamental marksmanship. All 4 passed. By 1100 hours the evolution was complete, and the snipers stood at attention while Marlowe conducted her final assessment. She'd removed her combat gear, back to plain utilities, but somehow looked larger now than she had at the start of the week. "You came here Monday as qualified snipers who couldn't perform under observation," she said. "You're leaving as trained snipers who understand that qualification and application are different skills. What you do with that understanding is up to you, but you now have the tools to maintain and improve your performance under adverse conditions." She pulled out 4 certificates she'd apparently prepared, formal documentation of the training week. "These aren't official school completions because this wasn't an official school, but they're signed by me and countersigned by Gunnery Sergeant Kovacs, and they represent my assessment that you 4 have successfully completed stress inoculation training. Put them in your records if you want, or burn them if you prefer. The training matters more than the documentation." Hastings accepted his certificate, studied it with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious texts. "Ma'am, could I ask you something personal?" Marlowe's expression suggested she'd been expecting this. "You can ask. Your call sign. We heard some Marines talking earlier this week, said you had a call sign from your deployment days. They wouldn't tell us what it was, said we should ask you directly if we wanted to know." The air temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Kovacs hadn't known Marlowe had a call sign, but the concept made sense. Snipers often earned nicknames based on their performance or personality. He found himself leaning forward, curious despite knowing this was potentially dangerous territory. Marlowe was quiet for approximately 10 seconds before answering. When she spoke, her voice carried weight that went beyond the words themselves. "My call sign was Widow," Marlowe said, and the silence that followed felt like a physical presence on the range. "Not because of any personal tragedy or dramatic backstory. Because in Helmand Province during my first deployment, I killed 7 Taliban fighters in 3 days, all confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 800 meters. The men in my unit started calling me Widow because I was making widows." She paused, and Kovacs saw something in her expression that might have been regret or might have been something harder to name. "I didn't choose it, didn't particularly like it, but call signs aren't about preference. They're about identity in the field, and Widow stuck because it was accurate. I was good at my job, and my job was killing people who were trying to kill my Marines." Vickers looked like he wanted to ask a follow-up question but couldn't find appropriate words. Marlowe saved him the trouble. If you're wondering how I feel about that, Lance Corporal, the answer is complicated. I don't regret the shots I took. Every target I engaged had been positively identified as hostile. Every kill prevented friendly casualties or accomplished mission objectives. But I'm not proud of the body count either. Pride suggests enjoyment, and I never enjoyed it. It was necessary work done under circumstances that required precision, and I was qualified to do it. She folded her arms, and Kovacs saw the defensive posture of someone who'd had this conversation before and didn't particularly enjoy repeating it. The name followed me through my next deployments: widow in Mosul, widow in Syria. Eventually it became shorthand for the female Marine sniper, which was reductive but not inaccurate. When I transferred to training command, I asked people to stop using it. Some did, some didn't. Doesn't matter much now. I'm Captain Marlowe on paper, and that's sufficient. The four snipers processed this information with varying expressions. Hastings looked thoughtful, Reyes nodded understanding, Chen seemed slightly uncomfortable with the visceral reality of what the call sign represented. Vickers finally found his voice. "Ma'am, 7 kills in 3 days, is that a record?" "No," Marlowe said flatly. "And if that's what you're taking from this conversation, you've missed the point. Records don't matter. Results matter. Those 7 kills prevented an ambush on a convoy carrying medical supplies to a civilian hospital. The metric of success wasn't the number, it was the convoy reaching its destination. I was a tool that accomplished an objective, nothing more." She checked her watch, clearly ready to move on from this topic. "You four have the rest of the day off. Monday morning you return to your regular training schedule with Gunnery Sergeant Kovacs. But I'll be checking in periodically, and I expect to hear that you've maintained the performance standards we established this week." Dismissed. The snipers departed with visible reluctance, clearly wanting to extend the conversation but recognizing that Marlowe had closed the door on further discussion. Kovacs watched them go, then turned to Marlowe. "That was difficult for you," he said. "It wasn't a question." Marlowe shrugged, but the gesture looked tired. "Call signs are complicated. They're identity markers that carry context most people don't understand. Widow meant something specific in Helmand. It meant competence, reliability, lethality. But stateside it sounds like bragging, or worse, like I'm celebrating death. I'm not. I'm just someone who was good at a job that needed doing." She gathered her equipment, started breaking down the audio stress system. Kovacs moved to help her, working in comfortable silence for several minutes before speaking again. "For what it's worth, ma'am, those 4 Marines learned more this week than they would have in a month of standard training. Whatever discomfort came with discussing your past, the benefit to their future justified it." Marlowe nodded, accepting the assessment without false modesty. "That's the calculus I use. My comfort matters less than their competence. They needed to understand that the standards I was teaching came from practical application, not theoretical knowledge. The call sign makes it real in a way that rank or qualifications don't." They finished breaking down the equipment in companionable silence, loading speakers and cables into the equipment truck that would return everything to the supply depot. Kovacs noticed that Marlowe handled the work with the same precision she applied to everything else. No wasted motion, no inefficiency. Every item secured properly, every connection verified before moving to the next task. "Gunny," she said as they finished, "can I ask you something off the record?" Kovacs nodded. Off the record in the Marine Corps was a fiction, but a useful one that allowed for honest conversation. "This program you're running here, Scout Sniper Training with emphasis on stress inoculation, are you looking to expand it?" "That's the goal," Kovacs admitted. "Division wants standardization across all sniper training programs. What you demonstrated this week is exactly the kind of methodology they're looking for. Practical, scalable, effective." Marlowe leaned against the truck, and for the first time that week she looked genuinely relaxed. "I've been developing curriculum at Quantico for 3 years. It's important work, but it's disconnected from the reality of what these Marines will face. I write training manuals and review lesson plans, but I'm not in front of actual Marines anymore. This week reminded me why I joined the Corps in the first place." "Which was?" Kovacs asked, genuinely curious. "To be useful," Marlowe said simply. Not to prove anything, not to break barriers or make history, just to be useful in a capacity that mattered. I grew up in Arizona, Navajo Reservation, watching my community struggle with poverty and limited opportunities. The Corps offered a way to develop skills that had value, to become someone who could contribute. Turned out I had a talent for shooting, which the Corps refined into expertise. Everything else, the deployments, the call sign, the medals, that was just consequence of trying to be maximally useful. She pushed off the truck, stood straight again. But 3 years behind a desk has made me less useful. I'm educating instructors who educate Marines, which is important but indirect. This week was direct. Immediate impact, measurable results. I'd forgotten how much I needed that. Kovacs understood what she wasn't saying. The transition from operator to administrator was difficult for anyone, but especially for people who'd excelled in operational roles. The desk was necessary. Someone had to develop curriculum and standardize training, but it lacked the visceral satisfaction of seeing immediate results. If division approves the program expansion, he said carefully, they'll need someone to run it, someone with operational credibility and instructional expertise. Someone who understands both the theory and the application. Marlowe met his eyes and Kovacs saw understanding there. Are you suggesting I apply for a transfer? I'm suggesting that if such a position were created, you'd be the ideal candidate, and that I'd be happy to endorse your application. A smile crossed Marlowe's face, genuine and unguarded. I'll think about it, Gunny. Seriously. But for now, I've got a flight back to Quantico tomorrow morning, and about 47 hours of administrative work I've been ignoring all week. They shook hands, and Kovacs watched her drive away in the equipment truck, disappearing down the range road toward the main base. He stood there for several minutes after she'd gone, thinking about talent and opportunity, about the Marines like Marlowe who represented the Corps' future if the Corps was smart enough to use them properly. His phone buzzed. Text message from Staff Sergeant Reyes. Gunny, the Marines are talking. Word spreading about Widow. What should we tell them? Kovacs considered his response carefully before typing. Tell them the truth. Captain Marlowe is a Marine who exemplifies the standards we aspire to. Her past earned respect. Her present deserves it. Anyone who has questions can bring them to me directly. He sent the message, pocketed his phone, and walked back toward his office. Behind him, the range sat empty, but somehow it felt different than it had before Marlowe's arrival. The space held potential now, the promise of training that could bridge the gap between qualification and application.